Welcome to Language Memory and Rhetoric, the view from Europe. I'd like to thank the Institute for European Studies and Roberta Perger and the Burns Institute and Helena Goldberg in particular for putting this panel together. I'm going to keep my opening remarks pretty short as I've been asked to do the double duty of moderating and presenting, so I don't want you to have to listen to me talk the whole time. Language in linguistic anthropology is praxis or practice. It's a practice, says Bernard Bates, of ideas unfolding in genres of activity, agreed upon in the process of communicative action. So what this means is that language is something that we all do and we negotiate. We negotiate all the time. Meaning is constantly made and remade while we talk. Rhetoric is a bit different. It certainly has something to do with language, but it also includes some element of persuasion. There, of course, are different ways of persuading different peoples in different places and different languages. Aristotle's rational persuasion is not the only type. Mastering rhetoric involves successfully sending a message to one's listeners and is particularly salient in the study of politics. George Bush famously sent the message of a guy trying really hard. Despite all the text he utilized, often with difficulty, he was the guy that would never give up, and that was his message. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, where I work, sends a message of stability. Despite his openly corrupt political practices, his xenophobic musings, he is the guy that can run the country and will continue to run the country. Then there's memory. And I find memory challenging to define, and when I do, I often ask my son, who is 8. And I did that last night, and he really surprised me. So I asked him, what is memory? And he said, memory is remembering things. And then he kind of paused. And then he said, it's actually perspective, I think you could say, of what the past is. People have different perspectives of the past. Like in World War II, a soldier would have a perspective of the past, fighting. And a civilian would have a perspective of the past, pain and loss. Sometimes it depends on who. And yes, he actually said this, I was shocked. You can memorize that moment, he said. You can feel the pain. You can feel the fighting and the loss, and that feeling is memory. And I thought, okay, I don't need to look this up. I'm just going to use that, which is what I'm doing now. And I think it's a pretty great definition. I'll also add that we narrate our memories to and for ourselves and to and for others. And these narrations change with time. Often these narratives become part of our identity, part of the identity of a group, a political group, part of the identity of a political party, of a nation, or of a state. So as you listen to our stories of Ukraine, Germany, the north of Ireland, and Hungary, where meanings are negotiated and tested constantly, I invite you to think deeply about language, rhetoric, and memory. How are these concepts entwined or related? How are they tested? How are they different? How do they contribute to our understanding of the world? And how do political actors use language? And what can we learn from their stories, from these stories and these analyses? I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Irit Jekyll, who is an assistant professor in Germanic Studies and Jewish Studies here at IU Bloomington. Her work focuses on the relations between collective memory, media, and the public sphere, particularly on Holocaust memorialization and the representation of ethnic and religious difference in contemporary Germany. Petro Kuzik is an associate professor of international relations and of diplomatic service at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv in Ukraine. He is currently a visiting scholar in the Burns Institute here at IU and happens to be my office mate. He's a good one. His research interests include post-communist transformation in East and Central Europe, nationalism and international relations, Ukraine's democratization, and European security. His most recent research has focused on the problem of Ukraine's alleged regional and societal divisions and their international discursive misinterpretations, as well as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Dr. Finu Ala Nikolaioberd, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, is a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool. Her current research focuses on minority or minoritized rights in the north of Ireland, with particular attention to the campaigns for an Irish Language Act and same-sex marriage. Her work combines qualitative and ethnographic methods with theories of decolonization to explore how grassroots activism produces material and social transformation. I'm Jessica Story-Naj, adjunct faculty here at the Burns Institute and a research associate in anthropology. I'm a linguistic and political anthropologist who studies political discourse in Hungary, East Europe, and the European Union. I'm interested in multimodal political communication, talk about conflict and war, disinformation, semiotics, nationalism, and how political talk affects notions of identity and belonging. So I will let our panelists start. I think, Irit, would you be so kind as to go first?
Jessica, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the conference organizers for putting this together, and students and everyone who came early in the morning. So I'm going to talk about a phrase. The phrase is never again. And I'm going to say, or to tell you, how it's used in Germany in the past 2 years, historically. And I'll suggest that it's, and this is the only concept that I'm going to use here, scientific, it's a floating signifier. What does it mean? That its meaning is never fixed, and it bounces off, and I would say it bounces off two signifieds, two things that are signified: the Holocaust and genocide, and war. It's been used as a popular phrase in Germany in 1924 in resisting World War I, or resisting the outcomes of World War I. There was a very famous poster that Tiskette Kollwitz made, Never Again War, Nie wieder Krieg auf Deutsch, with the youth raising their hand, one hand, and putting another hand on their heart. I actually had a slide to show this to you, but we don't show slides, so I'm going to describe it out of aesthetic interventions to you, because the other thing that is really important for us when we think about language, memory, and rhetoric, and specifically with reference to this phrase, is that we juxtapose aesthetics, time and place, and how people speak, where and to whom. Okay, so there was this poster in 1924 that an artist, a woman artist, that actually at her time couldn't go to art school because art schools didn't accept women, so she went to Paris. There they did accept women, and created to show a youth, actually genderless, that's also important to us when we go to Never Again, saying, let's not do it again. That's 1924, 10 years after the beginning of World War I in Germany. And we leave Never Again War kind of on the side, and now we go back to the end of World War II. And Never Again was used actually by victim groups in inscriptions on memorials. One was in Treblinka, the other one was in Dachau by Munich. And there actually they used it in multiplicity of languages. So one of them was German, one was Yiddish, and the other languages of the groups that were victims of World War II. And this is an inscription on a memorial. Then 2 years ago happened, there was October 7, Hamas attack on Israel. And in Germany, there was a spike in using Never Again. In fact, there is legislation that passed in November 2024 that is called Never Again is Now. Protect, it's three words, what to do with Jews. Protect, defend, and a third thing about Jewish life in Germany. Never Again is now we go back to the floating signifier, right? Never Again is now actually adds sort of a signified, right? It takes what we think about the past and throws it to the present as a threat. It's now, it calls us to do something now. Okay, so that is legislation, non-binding legislation. It's a motion passed by most of the coalition parties in Germany. Let's see, the CSU, the Christian Democratic Party, the SPD, the FDP, and the Greens joined. The Left Party didn't join. And the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, actually was one of the initiators, but the coalition parties didn't include it. But it celebrated this motion. It used Never Again is Now. And the legislation passed. in November 9th, 2024. Why do I tell you November 9th? Because most of the times that the phrase is invoked is around ritual time. And that will connect us to discussions of memory, right? And this is November 9. Actually, it's 2 days in terms of the Reichskristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, when the Nazis attacked Jewish institutions and people and Jewish leaders in 1938, right? We think about it in November 9. It was 2 days also in daylight, but it signified through night. Okay. And what is interesting to me, now we go back to the floatedness about the signifier, what is interesting to me is that it is connected after October 7 in Germany to protecting Jews, and actually to mix it up. Thinking about protecting Jews in Germany and protecting Jews in Israel and Jewish life, it's called Jewish life, in Germany. And it is used as a warning, and actually when it is used in relating to preventing another Holocaust, it bounces off the war. And since we work in area studies, it of course also connected to the food invasion of Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, because that's 2022. There is talk about never again, also with regard to war. But because it's so centrally staged, and again, we're talking about meaning-making processes, so I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm describing to you a process, and we're analyzing it together. Because it's so centrally staged, as connected to protecting Jews today after October 7, as I said, in legislation, in ritual time, ritual space, and I'll tell you more about ritual space in a second, it actually puts in a different position how the referent, right, is working vis-a-vis war. But I added the war here because I think these two are related. And what's interesting about the deployment of the phrase in the past 2 years, actually, differently than what we heard, the brilliant paper that Jessica Storinaj and Gardner Bovington presented yesterday of the an empty sign as a form of demonstration. Actually, this one over-signifies. Right? So, and this is something that, I mean, the person who coined the concept of the floating signifier, Ernesto Laclau, actually said because of some over-determination or under-determination vis-a-vis the signified, it doesn't get fixed, or it cannot be fixed, right? We go back to never again. So we don't know never again what. We just know we're called to avoid something that shouldn't happen again. But people actually know. So we will keep it active when we think about the other cases of my colleagues, when we think, okay, on the one hand, we don't name something that shouldn't happen again. We also don't know what happened to whom, when, and where. And on the other hand, we do know. And we know that we're called to do something in the present. It's an activating, or it's actually an elaborating symbol. And one last thing I would say in this regard is that it's been, and this is where I bring you back to the aesthetics of saying it and also seeing it written. It was projected on the Brandenburg Gate on November 9, 2023. So a month and 2 days after October 7, by the city of Germany, the mayor, the acting mayor then and still, is a Christian Democratic Party member, Wegner. And so it was projected. The Brandenburg Gate was lit at night or covered with a white color, and in blue it was written "Nie wieder ist jetzt" with exclamation mark. Never again is now. And Magen David, I would say in Hebrew, Star of David was on the top. So the signified was that we're projecting the safety of Israel, or Jews in Israel, because that's the Magen David, on the sign or the symbol of German statehood. And the protection of Israel is then, and Jews, is then aligned with what the state projects. And so on every November 9th, we have some reference to never again is now. We have the projection on the Brandenburg Gate. We have the legislation or the motion in the Bundestag a year after. And one last thing I would say about that is that in the legislation, in the motion, and in speeches, when the phrase was presented, it was connected to to anti-Semitism, and I took good care of telling you about Holocaust and war before we got to anti-Semitism, but it's heavily associated with anti-Semitism. There is a rise in anti-Semitism, a spike, more than doubling since October 7 in Germany, alongside attacks on other minorities, racialized minorities. And so it is associated with protecting Jews from anti-Semitism after October 7. And again, bringing together that when we think about Jews, we think about Jews, protecting Jews in Israel, and the speech around it after October 7, and that actually changed, is to say protecting Israel is Germany's Staatsräson, or reason of state. In a way, it trumps the Constitution, because it's a reason of state, and the connection between Germany after the Holocaust and Israel stands again in this symbolic crossroad as a guiding light. Okay, I think I'll stop here. And when we discuss it again, I will talk about how it's invoked in other countries, because it's also a transnational story that travels. Okay, thank you.
Petra?
Okay. All right, I'm going to speak about a fairly recent past and actually very fresh memory. So basically focusing on the vocabulary, or the problem with vocabulary of representation of Ukraine's diplomatic efforts to bolster the international assistance to Ukraine. And I will start from reminding everyone, I'm sure that there are a few guys here with international relations background, so they know what Budapest Memorandum was and what it meant. And so I will briefly refresh your memory about that. So basically, that was a document that was signed by major nuclear powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation, in return of Ukraine renouncing a massive nuclear arsenal, I think it was the third largest in the world in the beginning of the 1990s. And so basically that was a document entitled Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. And so there was the obligations to respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, to refrain from a threat or use of force, and also another thing, an obligation to provide assistance through the UN Security Council should Ukraine become a victim of aggression. Well, we all know it didn't work, right? Probably one of the reasons was probably that it wasn't intended this way. So, you know, the document, it was a 2.5-page text with very vague, terminology, and also the title of it, or the type of the document, memorandum, also tells a lot, right? So, actually, and naturally, after a while, it became a symbol of, weak or non-existent commitment of on the part of the Ukraine's Western partners to Ukraine's security. And also, I think, wishful thinking that Ukrainians had in those days. And also partly political manipulation. Why political manipulation? Well, actually, when you recall one very interesting thing about this document, that it was written in 3 languages, English, Russian, and Ukrainian. The English version There they use the word security assurances, so the term assurances was there. But interestingly enough, it was translated into Russian and Ukrainian as security guarantees. So you could see that there was already some manipulation going on there. I'm not going into details why that happened. But what I want to say is that everyone thought we learned the lesson, right? So never rely on these weak documents, weak obligations. But this term, the usage of it, security guarantees, actually made a comeback in Ukraine, starting from the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Actually, I will give you two examples in what context it has been used recently. One of them is a number of security cooperation agreements that Ukraine signed with 24 of its partners, most of them NATO members, following the joint declaration of support for Ukraine by G7 members, but also other European and North American partners of Ukraine. So basically, these documents were signed in order to fixate these efforts of our partners to assist Ukraine in its bolstering its defense and deterrence capabilities. And those were actually very good documents, I should say. Although, again, they are quite vague. They are basically framework agreements, and they don't offer something as a mutual defense obligations as Ukraine probably hoped for. An interesting thing about these documents is the representation, the language of representation of its nature and content in Ukrainian public discourse, domestic one. So basically, the media, but also the political functionaries, leaders, some of them, still talk about security guarantees. So they were, explaining to the public all these documents as some kind of security guarantees that Ukraine would get at some point. They even touted this as almost a substitution for the Article 5 of NATO Charter, which it was clearly it wasn't. Another example is the initiative that received the name of Coalition of the Willing, starting from March this year, in view of the changed approach to Russo-Ukrainian war of the American administration. The mostly European partner decided to take a leading role in assisting Ukraine in its war efforts against Russia. And so British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, they came up with this coalition of the willing, also together with a couple of other leaders and nations. Again, an interesting thing about how that was portrayed, how in the Ukrainian domestic public discourse was that it was more often than not translated into Ukrainian as a coalition of resolute. However, a very important thing about this coalition of the willing is that it lacks resolve or resolute to, offer Ukraine some kind of security guarantees. Although this time, the term actually featured in these discussions already. So you might say it was a win for Ukrainian diplomacy. On the other hand, when you follow the news and how it was presented in Ukrainian discourse, you also find that Ukrainian media outlets would translate their Ukrainian text into English using this coalition of the resolute term and not the coalition of the willing. So you might think it's not a big deal, but still, language matters, of course, and the difference in the meaning is still there. So, I don't think I have much time to continue to explain all the nuances there, but I will basically conclude by, saying that why this choice of vocabulary? Definitely, if we're talking about Ukraine's efforts internationally, that would be, the Ukrainian diplomacy trying to inflict or impose these terms in discussions with the partners, with the allies, in order to, bolster their wartime assistance to Ukraine. And it's understandable. The more interesting thing is about the domestic discourse. Why is that so? Why do they choose, the stronger words, the more, convincing terms, which actually don't feature in their communication with the Western allies and partners? Well, I find several reasons, of course, there. But one of the major is probably, something that you still might call wartime propaganda. And this is for, convincing the population, the people in Ukraine, that the world is still helping, and so that we're still going to be fine. So it's like calming the people down in some very harsh and dramatic circumstances, but also political manipulation. It's also, we have to understand that the authorities in Ukraine are also political agents. They have their own interests, and they want to look better, they more convincing to the public and to their electorate. Thank you.
Thank you, Petro. Sorry, this clock is so menacing, so we have to continue on. Yep. Finuala, would you take us into our third presentation?
Yeah, thank you. And I commend your efforts with my name. It's Fanula, but I often get Finguala, so no problem there. I have some slides I'm just going to share. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see them, but we'll give it a go anyway. Can you see that PowerPoint? Yeah, great. Okay. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm upset I can't be there in person, but it's great to, from what I can see, the place looks really well attended. I'm going to try and slow down my accent, but if there's anything that needs clarified, I'm happy to take questions at the end. So today's talk is going to begin kind of with a potted history of Ireland and partition, because we can't talk about language in Ireland without talking about the geopolitical history of it. And then we're going to move on to the seeds of language reclamation in West Belfast before talking about Irish medium education, and then what we have seen, which is really a grassroots assertion from below in one of the most deprived areas in the United Kingdom through language, which is Gaelic. But really the theme of this talk is how education can be used or appropriated for social transformation. So these maps here kind of give us a glimpse into colonial language shift in Ireland, with the first two images showing language decline throughout the 19th century. And we see really a dramatic decline in the number of native Irish speakers or Gaelic speakers after the Great Hunger that took place between 1845 and 1850 were those who were most impoverished still spoke Irish and were therefore more vulnerable to blight. So either through emigration or death, we had this massive decrease of native speakers. We see here in this map by the 2000s, it's a fairly bleak image. Anywhere where you can see circles, they are what's known as Gaeltacht areas, and we're going to get into that a little bit more, but a Gaeltacht is an area or a place where Irish is spoken. So it can be districts, which is the official definition of them, or it can be something as simple as in my own house, for example, we speak Irish, so that might be termed a Gaeltacht as well because it's a place where Irish is spoken. So there were numerous revival attempts throughout the 19th century, and these were really inspired by European romantic nationalism. And these attempts were led by a radical intelligentsia, but they did attract widespread grassroots support. So even though it was more of a middle and upper class led movement, it had a broad base that it could draw upon. And there was a second revival attempt at the end of the 19th century, and this was the most successful in arresting the decline. And this influenced the 1916 Easter Rising, which was an insurrection which later led to independence for the southern 26 counties of Ireland, and with the northern 6 counties partitioned. So after this insurrection, the map of Ireland looked like this, with the northern statelets still under the control of the British. And in the south, we had an Irish Free State. It's now an Irish Republic. But within the 6 counties, we had an Irish nationalist minority, and it was very specifically designed so that there would be a minority of Irish nationalists and a British Unionist majority who held political power. And some terms you might have seen for this is, Catholics and Protestants. More modern terminology is CNR and PUL, which is Catholics, Nationalists, Republicans, Protestants, Unionists, Loyalists. I prefer to lean on the nationalist aspect of it because the wars that have been fought in Ireland have not been over religion. Religion has been used as a marker, as a social marker to denote nationalism. So under partition, within the north, we had, I'll just go back to this map here. It was a British Unionist majority, and that majority was maintained through quite shrewd gerrymandering and disenfranchisement of voters. A vote could be obtained through paying £10 in household rates, which meant that a lot of houses were not given to Catholics or Irish nationalists at the time. They were primarily given to British Unionists, which disenfranchised Catholic nationalists, and it was 1 vote per household unless you paid £50 in rates. In that instance, you could get 5 votes. But in terms of Gaelic or the Irish language under partition, the modest gains that had been achieved through those revival efforts in the lead up to the 1916 Rising were squeezed out by the Unionist government. So they made it very difficult for Irish to be taught in schools, and they did that through removing funding and introducing certain criterion for Irish to be taught. So this led to the number of pupils who were studying Gaelic between 1923 and 1926 falling from 5,500 to almost 1,300. And there was a very shrewd policy here of marginalisation rather than outright eradication. And as one education official said at the time, a ban would stimulate Gaelic to such an extent that the very dogs in Belfast, at any rate on the Falls Road, will bark in Irish. And the Falls Road is in West Belfast, and it's a heartland for Irish republicanism. So you can see here, there was very clever political maneuver in here not to encourage any resistance through language. This was also paired with coercive, violent attacks. So in Belfast between 1920 and 1922, there was 257 Catholics murdered, as well as 157 Protestants and 2 of unknown religion. And while these numbers may seem fairly even, At the time, Catholics comprised only a quarter of the population, so therefore they were 6 times more likely to die from violence in that period. And Michael Farrell, the historian, concluded at the time that the Catholic population had been beaten into submission, and Irish language activists were demoralised and disarray, meaning that they couldn't respond to the marginalisation that was happening of Gaelic at the time. So it was a very clever two-pronged approach of coercive violence as well as marginalisation rather than eradication. And then what we have is about a generation later, we have people who didn't experience that coercive violence, but we also had a culture of silence around that violence. So it wasn't really passed on to newer generations. And in the 1960s, we have a loose organisation, and they had termed themselves Pobl Fairste, which means Belfast Community, established around 1965, who didn't have this fear because that memory wasn't reproduced. And they wanted to connect Gaelic to the material well-being of the Irish population. And in contrast to previous attempts, this was almost an exclusively working class organisation. And they established a Gaeltacht, or an Irish-speaking area. And they also established the first Irish medium education primary school. I think that's elementary school in the States in 1971. And this school was deemed illegal and it was not recognised by the states. However, by this stage, the Troubles had broken out, the 30-year conflict. And even though the school was illegal, it could operate under the radar because the security priorities were pushed towards the army and the Irish Republican Army. So this is what that Gaeltacht looked like when it was being constructed. It was very simple. It was just a row of houses, and that has since increased. But the activists were very, very keen to create a strong connection between language and well-being. And there was a sectarian attack on Bombay Street in nationalist West Belfast, and 63 houses were burned, and you could have up to 3 generations at one time living in a house. They were really cramped conditions. So there were hundreds of people displaced, and the council were very reluctant to rebuild because Irish nationalists at the time, they didn't have the political leverage that they might have today to assert their right to housing. But Pobl Fairste, because they had built houses, they had the skills required to rebuild the homes, and they took out extra loans. They remortgaged the houses that they had already built and rebuilt the homes. And this was a really successful demonstration of direct action, and it was really the first indication that this community that had suffered a long time was asserting itself from below. And one activist said that we felt that the Irish language had to become more than just a cultural pursuit, that it had become involved in people's lives. It had to become involved in the well-being of the general community if it was to be taken seriously. We had to do something constructive to help a community that had come under attack and had been dealt a fairly sharp blow. So at the same time, the Troubles were ravaging here, and there was mass imprisonment of the Irish population during the Troubles. Internment was introduced in 1969, which was imprisonment without trial, and meaning that there were hundreds of young Irish nationalists arrested, and there is a strong tradition of prisoners learning Gaelic inside English jails in Ireland. Really as a means to refute criminality and to assert the political nature of their imprisonment. And they learn Gaelic within really, really harsh conditions. I'm sure people have heard of the HBOC protests, the hunger strikes, and the blanket protests. And because they were learning Gaelic within such harsh conditions, this inspired people on the outside to learn Gaelic. And this is in an area of significant educational underachievement, where it was really common for people to drop out of school at 14 years of age. And by 1984, there were 60 Irish classes in West Belfast alone. And they were heavily inspired by the prisoners to undertake this learning. And from here, we see then the development of an alternative type of education, specifically for the purposes of social transformations. And really this is activists appropriating the education system for their own ends. So College de Faoirse was the name of the secondary level Irish medium education school. So that's middle school and high school. And it was established in 1991 at the tail end of the Troubles. So in 1994, we had the peace process beginning, we had a ceasefire, but similar to its precursor, there was no support from the state. It was still deemed illegal, and there was no official recognition or status, once again, meaning that they were dependent on the local community for fundraising. But it was established within a community centre. So activists had acquired an old Presbyterian church and they named it Culturland McAdam O'Fake. And Culturland means like a site of culture. And McAdam is the surname of a Protestant activist for Irish, and O'Fake, the surname of quite a prominent Catholic activist for Irish. So straight away it's denoting the non-sectarian nature of the language movement. But this was within this site, there was examples everywhere of how the community was asserting itself from below. And I conducted interviews with past pupils of the school, and one of them informed me of the atmosphere there. And he says that the school in that early stage in the Culturland, that was a hive of Republican activity. And what you had was a whole array of self-help projects that were started by Irish language activists. Those self-help activists who ran the cafe, ran the bookshop, ran the theatre company, who developed a newspaper, a radio station. You couldn't understand College de Faoirse as distinct from them. They were all one. That was one entire modality. That support for the revival and project is where the school got its essence within the context of the early 1990s as well. The peace process whereby our community came out of the military-industrial complex, knowing that there was ways we could organise ourselves and our community could creatively engage in activism and instill positive ways of being and doing, and College de Faoirse was part of that. So you see here the school really not becoming part of the state establishment, but really something that was owned by the community. Many of the past pupils returned as teachers. I attended the school and most of my teachers were among that first cohort to attend. But there were others who got involved with creating community infrastructure to support the Irish language schools, to provide spaces outside of schools for Irish to be spoken. And this includes youth work, childcare, cafes, and other businesses. And Kieran, one of those who was involved with that, told me that there was a small group of them, because it was quite a small cohort to draw upon at the time. And they wanted to establish a space called Glornamona, which is a community site that is still thriving. And they basically just started off and says, what does the community need? What do we need? So they began with Irish language classes. They moved on to youth work, hosting political debates for that more informal learning. And the reason he did it, that they were so adamant that they would do it, was because the area was so materially deprived but culturally rich, and they wanted a hub to draw all that culture together. And he says here it's a working class area, a poor area, an area that suffered so much during the conflict, full of our families here as well. So if there's any area that is entitled to something like this, it's this area. So that was the first kind of effort we made to develop community conditions.
Fionnuala, thank you so much. I think we have to move on. So if you could close it up in about 30 seconds, that would be lovely.
30 seconds. I'll just say that the school is growing at pace, and I'm going to leave it on this final slide for people to read about the contrast from one generation to the next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I should have known, I lived in Dublin for a while, and there was a sign that said Dunlohari, and the way you pronounce it is Dunleary. You just need to take out a few syllables when things, I think, are written in Gaelic, for English speakers anyhow. Okay, I'll be very quick with my remarks then. So when I was conducting fieldwork in Hungary in 2019 and 2020, I was asking people about their national identity. I would kind of feed them some words like Magyar, which means Hungarian, Magyarság, Hungarianness, Magyarország means Hungary, and Nemzet, which means nation. Among others, right? And I was curious, I wanted to elicit their responses, what those texts meant to them implicitly and explicitly. So sometimes interviewees would bring up national holidays when I asked them what the nation meant to them. Sometimes people would bring up 1956. This text alone is salient. If you say 1956 in Hungary, it's like saying the 4th of July in the United States. You don't need to say Independence Day. This is the year of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, where Hungarians rose up against, they say, Soviet oppressors, so goes the narrative, right? And the Stalinist government under Matyas Rákosi, and they pushed him out for a few days, replaced him with a leader named Imre Nagy. But of course, the revolution weeks later was squashed harshly. The narrative goes the Americans did not come, they did not help, and the revolution was crushed by Soviet tanks in the streets of Budapest. A lot of the people that had to flee Budapest, mostly young men and middle-aged men, were called 56ers as refugees in other places in the United States and in London prominently. So the text 1956 is really salient. If you say 1956 in Hungary, people know exactly what you're talking about. Oftentimes, if you say it here in reference to Hungary, people know that you're referencing the revolution. So imagine my surprise when I was in Hungary interviewing a university student. And I asked him, to explain Nemzet to me. What is nation? And he said, I think, national holidays. And I said, okay. And he said, there was a revolution. It was in 45 or 52. And I can't remember when it was. And I said, 1956? And trying to hide my shock. And he said, oh, yeah, I think that's it. That's a national holiday. That's Hungarian. And he's like, I can't really remember when it happened, though, or what happened there, because history isn't really important to me. And I was surprised and intrigued. And so I started to bring this up in my interviews with other college students in that same town. And I was surprised to find that 1956 really didn't hold much weight with a lot of them. Oftentimes, those who weren't familiar with 56 weren't really interested in politics, right? So when I told my Hungarian colleagues here and in Hungary about this, who are academics, they almost didn't believe me. I think they thought I was lying. How could any university student not know what 1956 was? How could they not know why it's important? I'd be curious as to what these students think now. I think they're young professionals now, especially because Mr. Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, likes to utilize this narrative so frequently. So to note, Hungary is a parliamentary democratic republic on paper, but not so in practice. They have free but not fair elections. They're rated by Freedom House as a transitional or hybrid regime. And they are becoming more and more authoritarian. Hungary is becoming more and more authoritarian by the day. So part of Orbán's mode of governing and his way of control is giving frequent speeches and controlling the media for the most part. There are some free and independent media. But when he gives a speech, especially on October 23rd, which is a national holiday commemorating the revolution of 1956, it's repeated on television and on the radio constantly for about a week. People become really familiar with what he said. So on October 23rd, 2024, he said this. And I would like you to pay attention to how he talks about the Soviet Union and then how he talks about the European Union. So he says, quote, "In the autumn of 1956, history broke its banks because Hungary could no longer tolerate the oppression of the Soviet Empire. The Hungarians are a freedom-loving and freedom-fighting people. Soviet imperial oppression sought to put the resources of our country and the work of our people at the service of the empire instead of the national interest." Okay, this is kind of basic 1956 narrative, Hungarians fighting the Soviet Empire. He continued on to tell stories of Soviet oppression, and then he turned to the present day, and he said, To Brussels, independent Hungarian policy is unacceptable. Let us face that fact. Therefore, Brussels has announced that it will get rid of Hungary's national government. They didn't do that. They have also announced that they want to impose a Brusselite puppet government on the country. Also didn't do that. Here again is the old question. Shall we bow to the will of a foreign power, this time the will of Brussels, or shall we resist it? This is the weighty decision that now faces Hungary. I recommend that our voice should be as clear and unequivocal now as it was in 1956. We want only one thing, to live here in peace in the Carpathian Basin, according to our own rules and in pursuit of our own prosperity. 100 times over, we have proven that we are not afraid of being blackmailed by the empire of the day. We know that they want to force us into war. That's the war in Ukraine. We know that they want to force their migrants on us. We know that they want to put our children in the hands of gender activists. This reaches into a conspiracy theory involving George Soros. So he continues to engage conspiracy and later even evokes David and Goliath. So what's going on here, right? How does this work? The prime minister is evoking something I would call a chronotope of 1956, right, to justify his party's further centralization of power. A chronotope is a word that was used by Mikhail Bakhtin. He pulled from the Greek chronos, time, and topos, space. And he was writing in Russian, so now we have this in English. But it can be thought of as a time-space configuration that's represented in narrative of a text. So that means that it can align current events or symbols with the symbolic capital of the past, with the feelings that you get from hearing about past narratives, right? Orban claims that the EU is like the Soviet Empire was the empire of the day. And this forces the empire forces Hungary into the war with Ukraine. It prevents Hungarian sovereignty in a number of different ways. It controls Hungarian citizens and discourages the development of national identity in this mode of thought. So use of this particular historical narrative likens European Union polity making to an invasion by an empire, and the empire's name is Brussels. It is not the EU. When he says the EU is a different text for him, when he uses EU, he means something different. But Brussels is this evil empire. In order to maintain his ability, again, to continuously centralize power and to justify the pursuit of international allies outside of the Union, including deepening Hungary's alliance with Russia. So this is an interesting twist. According to Orban and coincidentally the Kremlin, Putin just wants peace in Ukraine, and Orban's party is one of peace, not war. The fight against the EU becomes a narrative of national survival, and a fight against empire and Brussels is a center of sovereignty-defying empire. So Putin becomes a rational ally with this logic. The narrative works domestically too, right? All of his opponents are puppets of empire, puppets oftentimes of George Soros, who is working behind the European Union or behind Brussels. And so real Hungarians have to fight them, right? So this utilization of the 1956 chronotope and others pushes younger people away from political engagement oftentimes. And the small but mighty press, for independent press in Hungary, is critical and forces and becomes sometimes satirical, which also kind of deters people and citizens from political participation. So this narrative of empire of the day is in direct conflict with the aims and values of the European Union, of which Hungary is a part. In fact, a willing and full-fledged member state in the European Union. But this strategy of not listening to Orban that I encountered when I was in Hungary might work, right? Some people encourage, they feel citizenship of a different kind, and that citizenship is European. So these young students that I talked to, they felt Hungarian, sure, but they also felt European, and they were proud members of the European Union. I never stop on a positive note when I'm talking about Hungary, so I'm going to stop there. And I think we'll open it up for discussion. Since we only have 20 minutes, perhaps we should start taking some questions from the audience, and then if we don't have enough, we can come back around to my questions.
Hi, Ryan McDonald, MA student of International Studies here. I wanted to ask about nostalgia and fascist, right? Memory is a very powerful and often imaginary tool constructed by fascist or hyper-nationalist governments, specifically saying that the present memory we have is a false consciousness, that the state has actually forgotten what it is. So how do we balance the validity of memory with these sort of like hyper-nationalistic impulses? I mean, like Ukraine would be something where it's like, the Ukrainians have simply forgotten who they are and we're just trying to remind them of that fact, versus like the validity of remembering and conserving these parts of our history.
I start? Yeah. I'll start. Actually, I think it's important that I mean, all of us discussed state narratives, memory activism, which is the activism by groups that are either for or against the state narrative outside of state channels to challenge a contested past. Okay, so the question is what's contested, and in the example that we just heard of Hungary, 56 becomes contested, and that changes the kind of positionality of who contests where and what. If we go to my example, I mean, you have many actors, memory activists, that use it to fight, never again, to fight right extremism in demonstrations, actually not around ritual time. It was in January 2024, anti-AfD, Alternative for Germany, which is the right extremist party, also held signs, never again is now. They also held a sign that says CK AfD. And so actually the juxtapositions are important of what the state says and what activists can say against and on what kind of stage. So I can leave it here just to kind of hold the possibility that memory is not only prescribed or inscribed, right? It is a space of making sense of reality and the past in the tools that we have in the present with the values that we have now to employ. And it stops having shelf life, as Halbwach said, when it doesn't make sense anymore to a group. So if the group of those youth say, our way to resist Orban narrative or rhetoric or propaganda is to say, I don't know what 56 is. That's actually a mode of resistance, of memory activism by individuals against the contested past and contested in a way they decide. So I think that's kind of, to just add the complexity. That's it.
Okay. Well, I think that memory does many interesting tricks to us, right? So I'm presenting an example of a quite fresh memory, and still when you follow it, you can see how in different contexts the meaning is used very differently. So, for instance, in this case, I cannot imagine someone like from, political agents, experts, etc., forgetting about this Budapest Memorandum, for instance, right? But what is lost sometimes is the specific meaning in that particular context, and it's used with very different intentions in this case as well. So basically, I think that when we are talking about memory, it's not only about remembering, but also about forgetting. And this is where these tricks start, right? And referring to your question, it's where you have the window opportunity for all the kinds of opportunists to come up with different manipulations and lead the people the way they wish to. So that there is definitely a danger there. Yeah, I don't have a recipe how to avoid it, but it's stating this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Fionnuala, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the language reclamation movement in Belfast is actually an outlier in this, because with most language revival attempts, what we often have is this call to the present or to the past and wanting to return to some sort of romantic ideal in our minds, and because of the partition in the north of Ireland, and because so much of our history is violent, the activists in the north couldn't really call upon this romantic past the way the previous events could have. And as a result of that, you had to look to the future rather than to the past, and that still remains. But the far right is growing at pace in Ireland, and they also can't call upon the past because that's already been appropriated by kind of the centre and the centre left nationalist movements. The Irish language movement in West Belfast is I wouldn't say far left, but it's pretty left, very liberal. And far right in Ireland are really having this challenge of how can they use the past to whip up the present. And in a lot of respects, they've done what language activists have done, and they've looked to the future while using emblems of the past. So they use the Irish tricolour quite a bit, but the Irish tricolour they're frequently reminded of is actually a symbol of unity and bridging across differences. So it's quite interesting that they are finding that problem. So I feel that yes, memory is still an important mechanism in whipping up political movements. But what we're also seeing now is the culture wars, and it's the culture wars of migrants and of sexual and gender minorities as well.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Oh.
Marge Steiner, I'm a folklorist. Couple of comments, I guess, too, and would be interested in hearing your reactions. Never Again has also been used in this country, certainly, and those people who are pro-Palestine as well. Never Again, I know, has been used by Jewish Voice for Peace. And I think that was alluded to. With regard to Northern Ireland, years ago, I worked in a rural community in County Fermanagh, but I was wondering what has been the state of the language reclamation movement, and certainly now within the more contemporary context of cross-community efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So would you like to take that with the Jewish vote? No. In Fermanagh, there are, I believe, 2 Irish medium education schools, and that's Irish medium education is the fastest growing sector in the education system. And it's quite a local grassroots level that it's growing there. In relation to peace building, we have very interesting dynamics where there are a couple of projects that are directed towards British Unionists learning of Irish, really heralded under the banner of the Irish language is for everyone. But what I would also argue is peace building is the community regeneration activism that's happening in Republican areas that were previously enveloped by conflict-related violence. And instead, what you have is a strengthening of democracy. So one of the largest civic mobilizations in the North has been centered around the legislation for an Irish Language Act. And that's unrivaled in terms of other social movements in the north of Ireland. And I would argue that that should be viewed as peace building as well, because it's about strengthening democracy rather than a return to violence to achieve aims.
Thank you for this question. On my slide, there was reference to, of course, to the activism that is reclaiming the Never Again. And so actually it's been used, Jewish Voices for Peace here in the past 2 years to say never again for everyone. And that actually adds a referent. We know who is the actor, who is it directed toward. And they thought about it vis-a-vis the destruction of lives in Gaza, in the war that followed October 7. It was also used by Jewish organizations against the first Trump administration, the treatment of migrants. It is used, and that's very important because that's another side of naming, right? If we think about, if we name a problem, we can then also reclaim both, or like name what the solution would be and reclaim what the problem with the way it was deployed was. So definitely that's a site, and there is a big sign of never again for everyone in Ellis Island by Jewish activists saying, we know what it was to be, for ancestors in different generations to seek asylum or to be refugees. And then never again for everyone would be to kind of expand this morally. It's a moral call. It was also used by Meir Kahana, who was an extreme right leader of the Kach movement. There is a well-known sign, and that was the title of his book, Leolam Lo Od, Never Again. Kahana's far-right government party, Kach, was outlawed in Israel in the 80s. And then it was subsequently also murdered in the US. And that's that's the important element here is that is the connection between the different deployments, different cultures with different reference of never again and what kind of moral call it employs. One last thing, it's of course used in Argentina and Mexico in the Nunca Más movement against violence against women. And violence against civilians. And so actually, this kind of shows us the space that, that a floating signifier used by political actors in different positions, different times opens up when we think about democracy or fights for democracy and nonviolent struggles. So thank you for this question.
Yeah, actually, when I read your abstract and read Never Again, I was in Seattle briefly this summer, and in the International District, the Japanese Americans have put up a sign also that says Never Again.
Right.
And it's in reference to the atomic bomb, right? The bombs that went off on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And because there's been so much talk of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right? So I think it became really particularly salient, again, in that context as well.
Can I say a few things?
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Well, again, it's like using the concepts in very different, concepts in very different contexts generates really different meanings, right? So in Ukraine, I hate to say it, but the phrase "never again" is now considered a joke. I'm sorry. So that's at least what people now feel about these, once perceived as some kind of laws of nature after, the Second World War. So yeah, that's how it is nowadays in Ukraine. Yeah.
I'll say one more thing until the. There was a comic strip by John Sacco and Arch Spiegelman a year ago in the New York Review of Books called Never Again and Again and Again. And that was about two interventions of Jewish identified artists against the destruction of Gaza. And in an article I wrote about it, I called it Never, Again, because I think the neverness of the again, the repetition, and the fear of repetition is something that activists and artists try to intervene about. So, yeah.
I think we had a question back there.
Thank you all so much for a fantastic panel, very thought-provoking. I was hoping to pull on the thread of the mechanisms that lead to people coalescing around particular use of language and how I guess those sort of fora in which they're talking together then itself is informing the phenomena that we're seeing at the top level. And so sort of those mechanisms of change, I think really pulling again on where you just ended, that, you know, the continual reinforming nature of language and how it's being renegotiated in these type of situations.
So there's a theorist named Norman Fairclough who talks a lot about language and how it's dialectical, kind of taking that idea from Marx. But when we describe our reality, we also make it, and reality also makes language, right? So you can think of an example of an earthquake, right? An earthquake happens, and that's reality kind of, changing language. We talk about the earthquake, and the way that we talk about the earthquake and how we describe the earthquake also kind of frames the way that we see it and frames our reality. So this is kind of a basic idea, I think, in sociolinguistics, that there is this dialectical nature of language. But I'd be curious to what you all think here as well.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm with you. I would just add the element of circulation, right? I mean, the meaning-making processes of claiming meaning is such that it's negotiated between different actors and what they know or wish not to know. I mean, if we connect it to I think, to a really illuminating example of Ukraine now, okay, what do we do with it if there's nothing else to do with this, because it doesn't help us build who we want to be and to think about our moral position today? Then we have to do something else. And I think this is why we kind of see a change in a way which actors employ a phrase, how it becomes iconic, how it becomes reclaimed, or how it becomes actually worn out. And I leave it here. I want to listen to my co-panelists. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that as well. This is something that Irish language activists frequently debate, because in a place like Ireland, where we're so enveloped by English, why is such a minoritized language growing apace? And really the only explanation we can come up with for it is the social relations and how people feel when they speak to each other in Irish, and particularly because the language movement aims to be decolonizing, and we really do our best to decolonize. So it's about feeling freer when you speak Irish. And I know for me, my personal experience is that whenever I speak in Irish, I feel freer as a person. I feel more like myself, even though I probably have better English than Irish. And a lot of activists would say that that's similar for them. It's about how you relate to each other. And I suppose in the context of Irish as well, it's the specific choice that you're not speaking English. You're making that choice. You're choosing to speak Irish, and it's that kind of resistance to top-down colonial rule. So in short, it's how people feel when they speak a language.
Okay, we have two questions here.
Yeah, we have two
and then one
questions
there.
here.
Okay.
If there's a mic, I don't know.
Hi there, my name's Pete Murphy. I'm a British-Irish expat now living in the US, Fanula, Constantatu. When I was being brought up in London in the 70s of Irish parents, I would often come across the English police, and to markate where I was in life, I would say things like, as a young man, Chucky Allah, our day will come to the police. And this means, this was an inflammatory response. I'm wondering now, with my current interest in reconciliation, how language is censored. Chucky Allah now sounds like something that's not said by either side in the sake of keeping the peace. And I'm wondering how, based on themes we've already talked about, how we agree the best way forward, and it's sometimes unsaid. I'm just wondering, Fanula, with your experience, when does language become censored on both sides? to allow peace to be maintained?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if it's so much. I'm not sure how deliberate that censoring is, but I would agree with you that there definitely is a toning down of nationalism in relation to the language. For myself as well, like I wouldn't consider myself an Irish nationalist either, and that's there's probably two reasons behind that. The first being that the emphasis has been so local, that it has been about regenerating local communities, communities that are very poor. And the second is that there has kind of been, there's a tension between the North and the South, certainly, with some people in the South maybe having the opinion, you know, that Irish people in the North, they're not really Irish. And so there is kind of a move away from that nationalism, but there is also this desire to say that the language is for everyone. And how can you say that the language is for everyone if you're using phrases like Chucky or La, which are so associated with the Republican movement? So I think it's more about how does Irish fit in with the peace process and with a shared future. And as talk of reuniting North and South is happening, I think it's too politically risky to assert that connection between Irish and the Republican movement. But I do think it exists quite strongly at a grassroots level, and you can see that with bands such as NECAP and other programs that are being made, Irish dramas that are being made that feature the language. There is still that connection between the language and republicanism that isn't really present in modern day discourse, particularly in the media, when you have activists delivering press releases and that. So there's quite a tension there that doesn't really reflect what's still happening at a grassroots level in Republican communities.
Got it, Maha. Good.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Our clock has started blinking angrily at us because we are out of time. It turned red and then started blinking. So I think we're out of time, but we would love to take your questions in the interim. So.